Hello there, my name is Joaquin Milata, and I'm the host of the AI Digest podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the use and benefits of sloppy, fuzzy, and hallucinogenic generative AI. And if you're not if you're not already hooked, I don't know what to tell you. But who's going to be leading us through this discussion? We have a very special guest out of the land down under, Daniel Binns. Daniel, it's a pleasure to have you. What time is it over there right now?
It's just gone 11 a.m. 11 a.m. here in Melbourne. Yeah, yeah. Thanks,
Okay.
Joaquin. It's such a pleasure to be here, and yeah, it's been great, sort of getting to know you. And yeah, I've been a fan of the podcast, obviously, for since it began. So yeah, really lovely to chat.
Yeah, I think we have a 16-hour difference right now at 7 p.m. on my side.
Yeah,
Um, I don't regularly speak with people in Australia for this reason, but I'm very much appreciative that you made the time. Um, yeah, can you walk me through what this means, what this title means? I mean, it's quite a amusing and enticing description.
yeah. I mean, I guess the sloppy and fuzzy and messy is really where I think I've always lived in terms of working with technology. And my background is I'm a filmmaker and a film producer and writer. I've worked in documentary and corporate media and web media and yeah, all sorts of other bits and pieces over the years. But I think in approaching generative artificial intelligence, which is kind of where I've landed in terms of my research over the last couple of years, um, I found that it really is in, not thinking about it transactionally or not thinking about it instrumentally, but really in playing with it, in messing around with it, in finding its kind of edges and its limitations, but also where it itself is kind of playful and messy and interesting. That's where I've found the experience to be really fun, but also really educational. Like I've learned so much about the technology through using it in that way. But that's, yeah, like I said, I think that's kind of how I've approached making stuff with tech for my whole life. So it didn't really feel like that much of a stretch. And in the conversation that a lot of people are having around AI at the moment, this word slop comes up a lot, in a really, obviously in a pejorative way. But I suppose I come at it from a slightly different way in terms of like, okay, well, yes, absolutely, there is some AI content that is objectively, not doing good things in the world, but like, you know, we can also make all sorts of other stuff with it. And if we do that, what can we learn about its capabilities and its limitations and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, and I think it might also be incredibly important to maybe talk a little bit about your background and your interests. I
Mm.
mean, before we went live, we were discussing you had the itch to make another film, and that's very telling of your personality, your interests, where your mind. What is it? What's that saying? Where your mind goes, your mind grows.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, we were sort of talking about obviously in at uni I did communication and media, but with a media production specialization, and made a whole bunch of short films, made live TV, made audio and radio and podcasts and that sort of thing. So had a very mixed media um, education, but sort of landed on video production, and ended up working for a company that did some really interesting work in the corporate media space. I was doing work with church organizations, and I was doing work with pharmaceutical companies, and I was doing work with film distributors, and just really interesting and diverse content. And you'd have two or three of those jobs on at once, and so you'd be writing one thing and then heading out to shoot another thing and editing something else. And it was a really fantastic way to just get all of those skills baked into me. But obviously also, writing, I love writing, particularly screenwriting, but also all sorts of other creative writing. So I've always got something on the go, in terms of a script or an idea or something. But yeah, I think since obviously becoming, I was very lucky to get a full-time ongoing academic role at RMIT here in Melbourne. And, the irony of, I'm sure lots of people are familiar with this, but like the irony of having a full-time job means that you don't have time to actually kind of practice the thing that you're teaching other people. So I've made a couple of short films since I started, but yeah, like you said, I am, and particularly because a lot of this work I've been doing with Gen AI is very creative and is very, I'm extracting creative ideas and being inspired or whatever by that. I think there is a real drive for me to sort of go back to what I am very familiar with, which is script writing and filmmaking, and kind of see what's lingering around all this work I'm doing. Yeah.
It's just as an observation, it's very interesting to me that you've had such a diverse exposure to all these different forms of media production, writing, communication, and a lot of it is stemming in a very formal, professional manner. But yet you have this poet, artist, creative side of you, like Dr. Jekyll and Hyde. Like you go to your corporate job in the day, and then at night you morph and you say, "I have to express myself in the slop and the weird and the fuzzy and all these things." And I think that's cool, man. I mean, it's you haven't let that passion die, So
No, I don't think it's necessarily a Jekyll and Hyde thing. It's funny. It's a funny way of putting it. But like, I think certainly I've been at RMIT 10 years now, and it's a really, really incredible place. And I'm very, very lucky to work there because it's this real haven of interdisciplinary, creative, quirky, messy, experimental research. Like all my colleagues are practitioners, be it, radio producers or documentary makers or, filmmakers and TV people in general. So, it's a really wonderful environment to sort of be that kind of person where on the one hand, you do have that kind of academic inquiring mind, but also like teaching prep and all that sort of stuff. But I am, it's definitely not just outside of work where I have that, experimental, creative, playful stuff going on. It's an environment where that's welcomed and encouraged. And certainly in the last year or two, I've let it out a bit more in terms of sharing my work. And it's been received. I'm very lucky to say it's been received really, really well. Yeah.
Well, I celebrate the expressiveness and colorfulness, and I'm glad that it's not a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation. I'm glad that you're getting it at both day and night. So maybe I like to start with the bare bones of every idea, the kernel of truth, and then build up from there. What is a story? What is a story?
Yeah.
You start there.
Great question. And it's a question that I think is kind of, as much as that sort of critical, creative, playful approach to technology is at the heart of my work, I think that's another question that is really central to a lot of the work that I do, because I've always loved stories and loved language and wordplay and, how do we shape these things that we use to interact with each other, these words and sounds, how do we shape them into something that other people can understand? I think it's a kind of miraculous process, right? I know it's just the nature of communication, but lots of species communicate, but I think we do so in a very interesting and kind of excessive way. It's a lot of the things that there are certain essential communications that we have to make to each other, but we also embellish and we laugh and we entertain and we sort of empathize. And I think that's a really fascinating thing to get stuck into as a media person, a creative person, or just, I think, a person existing in the world and trying to make sense of how quickly everything's changing and how many different ways of broadcasting or receiving information that we have. So to answer your question, I mean, the way that I address it normally with students is I say that it's a way of making sense of the world. Story is a way of making sense of the natural chaos that surrounds us. And it is a human impulse, I think, to try and give shape to that chaos and to sort of corral it into an order that makes sense. So, in that way, the first sort of way that I think many of us encounter story is, on the one hand, it's through stories that we're told at bedtime. So we learn through simple stories that have, quite low stakes, ideally, simple characters that we can kind of follow, and we pick up these conventions of, what is a character, what is the order of events, what is a plot point, what is the conflict, and ideally, what's the resolution. So that's sort of ingrained in us from very early on. But also alongside that, from family, from people around us, from teachers, we are told stories constantly. And it's not fiction necessarily. It's just, this is the story of how 2 and 2 equals 4. This is the story of how, this word came to be, or let's read this book and talk about it in class. Or this is, you get home and it's like, how was your day at school? And you have to tell a story. So I think we are surrounded by story constantly because everyone, not just us and everyone around us is trying to make sense of just life. And it's a convenient way of structuring, the things that we remember, the things that we want to express. And yeah, we've sort of, over however many tens of thousands of years, we've sort of developed these little packages, these little conventions, these little toolkits that give us what we need to sort of relay information. And yeah, it's a really interesting thing that we do that for day-to-day communication, but also for entertainment, and to sort of for education and to learn things. And yeah.
That stream of consciousness was just invoking a whole lot of imagery in my head.
Yeah.
And I wanted to jump on that, but I wanted to intently listen and follow through everything you had to say, every drip of every word. I never run out of entertainment myself. I use words like funhouse mirrors to expand and make skinny and distort and twist and play and hyper extend concepts and ideas that needn't be so like, hyper extended. But in I found previously in professional settings such a struggle to get to the point and say, so what's in it for me? Answer the core requirements of communicating effectively. And it's been a struggle of having to peel back to the essence of communication. What is the objective? What is the conflict we need to resolve? And in what chronological order is this going to work? And who needs to do what? Right? What else is there to think about?
And I think that's, I mentioned it briefly, but that is the flip side of that human impulse as well, right? Is, we needlessly embellish the core message, right? And sometimes that's positive. If if you think about a great film or a great novel, it wouldn't be what it is if you just had like the basic plot, you know. But yeah, the flip side of communication and the flip side of language is that it can be, you know, needlessly stretched out and needlessly, you know, sort of obstructive, and it can be manipulative, it can be destructive, it can be, yeah, needlessly kind of harmful in a lot of ways as well. So I think that, you know, also that idea of, you know, the human impulse to kind of embellish and communicate and layer things on top of rather than keep to the core of something. I mean, that's also the nature of creativity. And I think that's something that's one of the big questions that we're sort of grappling with at the moment is, you know, if we do have these machines or systems or you know, companions that can kind of strip away all the nuance or reshape what we've said in terms of our own expression into something different, where does that leave us in terms of, you know, that human impulse to sort of maybe not sugarcoat or maybe not, you know, needlessly embellish, but to like you say, to use words to in a particular direct, specific, intentional sort of a way. And even if it misses the mark in terms of its intention, you know, at least it's still yours, and you have that opportunity to then kind of wheel it back and say, oh no, I know I said that, but you know what I meant was, and that's kind of the give and take. But yeah, you're right. It's words and stories are, yeah, they can get in the way as much as they sort of make life enjoyable and livable. And yeah, it is definitely one of those big questions that I think, regardless of whatever the mainstream conversation is around whatever technology or innovation, you know, it's one of those evergreen questions.
And I think in you talking about the intent
Mm.
and the specific distortion of whether it's a positive or a negative influence, whether it could be used as propaganda or a medium for conveying wisdom, lesson, moral, um, cultural, religious, whatever context. The charge of the sentiment of the words that are used, the focus of the actors and what that tells about them. Um, we're more we're moving towards a narrative, right? So can you talk maybe a little bit about the difference between an isolated story and more of a interwoven narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, on the one hand, it is like thinking about what we might in media studies call a text, which is an individual film or an individual episode of television or a book or, you know, a piece of software, and thinking about that as an isolated package of an experience or a story or a set of characters or a set of conventions. Um, and then there's, you know, my history, or not history, but like the way that I was sort of trained to approach texts. And this is partly media studies, but it was also just kind of how I always saw objects and stories and things in the world, is to think about them, like I said, in that world, within that sort of broader context of where it emerged in time, like what was going on in the world when that film came out, you know, who made that film or who was involved in that film and why they may have made the decisions that they made. If it's a piece of software, you know, what kind of environments or what kinds of, you know, requirements were required to run that, who had access to these things. So it's just a sort of contextually based analysis. I think if you're talking about perhaps how the world has maybe shifted in the last 5 or 10 years in terms of, you know, increasing, shifting ideologies and different politics and kind of reactionary discourse and things that are going on. I mean, like anything, there's so many different factors involved. I think there's political factors, there's technological factors, there's social factors, there's all sorts of things that feed into it. But I think the trick to kind of just, wherever you fit on any kind of spectrum, I think the trick to kind of maybe understanding it is to just sort of slow down a little bit and take maybe not a step back, but just to sort of stop where you are and to think about, okay, I've seen this thing in my feed, or I've been told this story, if you like, in my feed, and I need to sort of think about, okay, this emerged because of an algorithmic system that sort of recommends things to me based on what I've viewed before. So in that sense, it was kind of always going to come to me in that form. Then you sort of go, okay, what's this person saying? Where are they coming from? What's their kind of positioning? If I look at, the comments or whatever, what sort of feedback loops are kind of being perpetuated, and that goes for something that sort of shocks you or that kind of brings you in and entertains you or that sort of thing. It's this idea of, we live in a media landscape, a media environment. And, I like to think of it kind of as a bit of a meshwork of different intentions and purposes and personalities and technologies. And I think if you just sort of slow down a little bit and try and understand, that everyone, for the most part, everyone is trying to just sort of exist and figure it out, in that sort of mass storytelling, mass broadcast space. And then just sort of try and figure out for you, who are the outliers that maybe you sort of think, oh, I don't necessarily think I align too well with that person or whatever. And then there's always the option to just sort of, I know it's hard, but like just sort of take a break for a little while and, go and look at a tree or pat the dog or whatever you have available to just sort of ground yourself and kind of reconnect with, okay, no, I'm me and I'm here and that sort of thing. I think sometimes that's very necessary as well. Yeah.
I appreciate you giving the context and also bringing up the the machine-made material. I mean, throughout most, if not all, of human history, leading up to, say, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years ago, everything was pretty much man-made, right, or human-made, right, for sake of inclusivity. And now we have a means of producing text that isn't representing a particular perspective or viewpoints or encoded with lived experiences. Now we're getting into the hallucinogenic part. So maybe we could talk a little bit about this shapeless nature of LLMs. I think that's an important precursor to having a meaningful engagement around the rest of this topic.
Sure. I mean, the large language model is something that, and I make zero claim at all to be any kind of computer scientist or AI expert or anything at all. My origin story, if you like, with AI was working with a friend and colleague. From about 2017, 2018 onwards, we were mucking around together with small GANs or generator adversarial networks, little ML experiments, early versions of GPT, early versions of Stable Diffusion. And this was very much a creative thing for me. I wasn't, really looking into it for research, but this colleague and I were at that time playing around with the weirdness. So we were training these models on very small data sets of very specific sorts of material. So for example, scripts written by us or helped out, written by students, for example, of first dates for films. So, these scenes where these two people would be on their first date. And, that was effectively the brief for us and for the students, was just to write a 2-page script for 2 people on a date. And then we fed all that into, a very early version of GPT, probably GPT-2, I think. and then got it to generate what it thought was a good first date. And inevitably they would be very, very funny, or very, very weird, or, it was never like disturbing because the training data wasn't disturbing. It was all very sort of friendly, maybe a little bit funny, a bit quirky. But I think what we learned, we did that. We did some other experiments with sort of British town names, which was kind of a fun thing to play around with, like Wapping on the Water, or, that sort of hyphenated British regional town name. And what I think what was really interesting was that at that time, working with a little model, and effectively it was a small language model, I suppose, or, a little transformer, was that they weren't shapeless. In terms of working with that very specific data set and having quite specific instructions about what to output. So I think starting from that point was really useful for me, even though I wasn't actively trying to internalize what these things were doing. So then you fast forward to, for example, ChatGPT, end of 2022, and suddenly you've got this thing that is just a text box and whatever you can imagine, I suppose, right? I guess that's kind of the magical thinking that I think the emergence of chatbots, and particularly ChatGPT, really unleashed on the world, was this sense of, here's a text box and then whatever. There was no sort of connection, no clear connection, I suppose, between the input and the output, at least on the part of the user. It just felt like a magic box that I could ask anything and it would generate things for me. And so I think what the shapeless nature of LLMs, I think, comes down to that black boxness of them, in the sense that there is a real intentionally designed distance between the user, i.e. the input, and the output. And, companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, Anthropic does a little bit more in the way of education and that sort of thing, but you have to seek that out. These companies are keeping us at a distance on purpose. They might release a little research paper, or they might release a little video or something that tries to explain it, but they don't necessarily want us to sort of understand how our input gets to the output. They want to sort of maintain some of that magic, that mythology around it. And I think that can be generative, or so to speak, or help, that can be fruitful, to sort of have this kind of magic box that presents stuff to us. But it isn't sustainable, I think, in terms of us getting the outputs that we want from the tools, B, understanding the mechanics of these tools so that we can from a more informed perspective, decide whether or not we want to use them. And C, I think, being aware of the mechanics of the tools means that we can understand their impact in a more knowledgeable way. And by impact, I mean cultural, I mean ethical, I mean ecological, I mean all of the big questions, positive and negative, that are associated with the technology. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, the shapeless nature of the LLM is due to the fact that it is a complex phenomenon. It's an assemblage of different priorities, ideologies, technologies, algorithms. It's a blend of math and programming. It's a blend of culture and computation. It's difficult to comprehend, and that comes out in the fact that a lot of the researchers working on LLMs still aren't quite sure sometimes how it gives you the answer that it gives you. So, it's shapeless in so many different ways. But I think in learning a little bit about, some of the fundamentals in how it works, and in, playing with them and testing them creatively and experimentally and all that sort of stuff, that's where we get a sense of what shape it might be.
I saw the rise of prompt engineering last year with as a means to compensate for this non-deterministic function that
Mm.
happens behind the curtain. You just see shadows moving around, and you're like, "What the heck is going on there?" Can you give me the thing? And then you see the hands reaching out of the curtain, giving you the thing that you asked for.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, you mentioned that primitive way of engaging with a sort of a prompt engineer approach to kind of build a consistent or consistent-ish output. Um, how do we productively use slop and hallucinogenic outputs with a degree of certainty? I mean, you come from this background of capturing truth and communicating things in high constructive educational ways that give a good representation to the people that are your clients. Um, and you teach students how to use media as a form of communication.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're teaching them how to explore the nonsensical, divergent thinking available through these machines. So, how can we productively use it and not cry when it doesn't spell strawberry correctly?
That's a fantastically framed question. Um, yeah, I mean, you're right in that I have multifaceted experience when it comes to communication, and when it comes to, I sort of initially I sort of bristled at that idea of truth that you sort of began with, because nothing that I ever did with clients, or with even working in documentary, I mean, sure, there was a bit of a connection to truth and or objective reality, in the sense that these clients were going to be delivering products that would be out in the world, or the documentary that we were making had a conversation with a real person who wasn't playing a role or something. But it's always about spin, it's always about manipulation, it's always, in a sense, about working with the mess and the chaos that is, reality in all its sort of complicated, interwoven, enmeshed complexity, and all that sort of stuff, to find a thread that you can pull on and polish up and put out into the world. So, I guess what my job is a lot of the time is structuring experiences, um, for students, or for audiences, or for readers, or for clients, or whoever it happens to be. So it's interesting you mentioned prompt engineering, because I think the new buzzword is like context engineering, which is crazy, right? Like you set up a little world or a little sandbox within which the LLM can generate things to a certain, to a certain brief, which is a very, like, in some ways we've come full circle in terms of like, giving a model specific data to, and that's the only data that it can work on, or setting up a little agent, a non AI like agent, to sort of, learn chess or learn Go or whatever. So it's again, we're trying to corral and try to set parameters around this thing that is, kind of, we think is like this wild, out of control beast. So I think, for me, what was always most productive is to kind of let it be a bit feral, to sort of not set too many parameters around it to begin with, or to give it completely nonsensical parameters that it doesn't understand, or, that it wouldn't understand, it shouldn't understand. So asking it a ridiculous question, or only using punctuation as a prompt, or putting in nonsense words, or asking it to rewrite something 10 times, and each time you forget one letter of the alphabet or something, and just seeing how it copes with things that to humans maybe are kind of simple or interesting or experimental, like the forgetting a letter thing, or that even a human would just completely balk at. And I think the idea of hallucinogenic or hallucinatory AI comes from the fact that it is a generator, like it is a generative tool, and it is designed to generate stuff no matter what. So, and that's where the idea of, that we call it hallucination when it gets something wrong, which I think is stupid, because it's the same mechanism that means it gets anything right. It's not operating wrongly when it hallucinates. It's just doing what it always does. But I think in removing some of those constraints that maybe let it give us, seemingly realistic or accurate or coherent responses, we start to learn about its sort of preferences or its habits or the ways that it sort of sees us and the ways that it sees what we want and all of that sort of thing. So, for students, it means that they stop seeing it as this monolithic, terrifying black box, or not terrifying, but like this thing that they're very uncertain about and that seems very complex and unknowable. And for me as well, not just students, but myself, immediately you start to see it as, oh, this is a constructed thing that does some stuff really, really well, but also does a lot of stuff very poorly. And then that's where the fun is, in sort of teasing out those capabilities and those limitations and finding creative ways of pushing it into, fun, creative territory or slightly disturbing, creepy territory. And yeah, it's been a great adventure for not just students, but myself and colleagues as well.
In middle school, there was this little program website that you can hold down Shift key and insert an answer or a sentence. But it was a sleight of hand kind of trick where you would ask a question and then you would answer the question, but you would show somebody and then they would see that the machine is potentially like their perception saw
Yeah.
the machine was answering the question in a way that only a sentient being could do.
Yeah.
And
It's like
people
a mechanical website. Yeah.
we would get totally freaked out because it's like, oh
Yeah.
my god, did you know my name? How did you know that I did these things? And now with all these arguments that I've been seeing over the last 2 years, like doing the podcast and holding events, I can't blame people for wanting to impose a level of sentience into the machine. Um, the laptops and phones and computers have always been, to a degree, a projection of other people. So it's not such a crazy, transition of how you perceive this thing to be alive. And if you're not saying things that make sense to me, of course you're going to say, it's got some sort of disorder. It's not performing to use. But as you
Yeah.
said, this is a machine. It tosses dice behind the curtains and says, we'll go with these words and whatever. We'll shake the box and pull out the string of text, and here you go. And there's no way to see or determine what's going on in the background.
I think that you sort of raise a couple of interesting points there around, there's been, there were chatbots before there was generative AI, and these sort of tricks of programming or sort of
word generators, or take the question, slice the question, insertion, and make it, sort of like a Mad Lib contextualized to give you an idea of what it is that you're looking for.
And all the way back to Eliza, which was like the first one, and all that was just sort of picking a couple of words from the input and reframing it as a question. And we are, as human beings, we're pattern detectors. We want to recognize ourselves in things around us. So I think our threshold for thinking that something is sentient is so low, like, and it's the same if you're, staying in a different place and it's a weird bed and it's a weird room and the lights are out and you see a face, in the corner of the room, and nothing that you might be 40 years old, you're not a child, but you're convinced that there's this face in the corner of the room. So, I think we're conditioned already to sort of want to connect with things, whether they're human or not, right? We have objects that are very sentimental and personal and that we have a relationship with. I think, as you mentioned, with smartphones and tablets and laptops, our technology and smartwatches and all that stuff, our technology is very intimate with us already. And then you open that up to social media, the internet, and online conversations and all of that sort of stuff. We were in this really interesting moment for this technology to emerge. So on the one hand, you have this technology which has this long and storied and arduous history, and it wasn't invented by Sam Altman, no matter how much he wants you to believe that he did it. It was brought about by a lot of amazing pioneers and thinkers, and beyond, all the way back before World War II and Alan Turing even, we've been thinking about these questions. But, you sort of thrust this technology into an already oversaturated and very confusing media landscape. And it is going to be not just disruptive, I think, but like explosive in sometimes good ways and sometimes ways that I think don't help a lot of people sort of understand it and push people away from understanding it. I think people are just sort of reacting rather than, thinking about what the technology is and what it can do and what it shouldn't do. And yeah.
I know your stance on truth is a little
That's just, I'm a media studies person.
No, of course.
That comes from.
You know that you can shape the perception of somebody according to what kind of symbology or sentience or sequence of imagery you can inject into someone's perception, and that sort of makes truth a flimsy word, because what is truth? But I'm making these observations that you really strike me as a scientist. You said this is a shotgun, baby. The spread on this thing is it's going to give you a big spread of ideas, right? Like you inject the idea, being the bullets, you load it up, you shoot it, and there's a spread of possibilities. And rather than saying, oh, how can we make the barrel longer so that there's a greater accuracy and greater range of projectile being fired, how can we create a twist in the barrel, how can we use bullets that may remain intact and spin faster so that they can hit the target from a greater distance. He said, no, I don't want any of that. Give me bullets that will spread wider, and let's shave off the nose of the barrel so that it could just be a sawed-off shotgun. Yeah. And I really dig that. I think that's so funny, because it's like, well, let's objectively take notes, but we don't know what the hell's going to come out of this thing.
But I think that's a fascinating metaphor. And look, I think I've been a little bit more scientific, I think, with this than I have ever been with anything, in the sense that I'm exploring text and image and video and thinking about them all. But I think, to continue the metaphor of the sawn-off shotgun, which I'm totally going to steal now, I think it's the idea as well that you fire once and then, put the safety on or turn it around or whatever, and then just go and pick up everything that it's fired out and have a look at it. So, it means that you fire less, less often, which is, potentially ethically and ecologically probably a good thing. But it also means that you're paying attention. It's not just targeted. You're not like constantly generating, trying to find the perfect thing. Because I would argue that if you want the perfect output, we have human ways of getting good text, good images, good video, right? but I find all of the output genuinely, often really interesting, and either critically or creatively. Like it'll teach you something about what the technology is and what it can do or can't do, or it'll be good creative fodder that you can pick up and remix into whatever you want to do. Like I've done so much, like grab bits of different outputs and mush them together into like a world that I can sort of tell stories in, and characters that I can sort of develop, and that's been really, really energizing to me. I've sort of my creative energy sort of flagged on and off over the last few years, but particularly in the last year or two, like I've just been so even if it's like you generate something and it's all wrong, like at least then more about what you're after creatively. So yeah, I think the scattergun shotgun approach is definitely one that feels like it works for me, for sure.
I'm gonna figure out a way to jumble up those ideas. Creativity and shotgun have to snap together in some way for you.
It's there somewhere, yeah.
But yeah, Ben. I mean, I figure if it's not generative AI, you would have found some other creative medium format to go and explore and rigorously test. I know you preempt by saying, "Oh, I didn't go and set up all these controlled and different variations of the experiment," but you're testing the limits nonetheless and seeing what kind of tool yields what kind of outcomes and at what level it is this year and next year. And you're
Yeah,
teaching students, here's how I reason through these little experiments and tools, and here's what capabilities they have, and here's the limitations and constraints that they have as well. So, I just think that's a really
I
cool thing.
definitely, I love the idea of a tinkerer. I've known a lot of tinkerers. So my grandfather was a tinkerer, and we made a documentary back in the day about a wonderful man called Jim Frazier, he was a wildlife cinematographer who accidentally invented a fantastic lens that was used in a whole bunch of Hollywood movies and all that sort of stuff. But he was an endless tinkerer up until when he died a few years ago, just like constantly mucking around with stuff. And I think it's a really tinkerers and hackers, and I mean hacker in a positive sense, in the sense of just like pulling things apart, even if you don't know how they go back together again. Like it's, and I think that curiosity and that creative spirit that comes from those sort of traditions and practices is really something that I resonate with. And there is always a risk to that as well. I think that being aware of the fact that you might get something wrong, or you might get a result that's undesirable, but then just kind of, that's part of the process. Mark that down and continue. I think that's a really net positive way of engaging with technology, with the world, with language, with other people. Don't pull people apart and put them back together again. That's not what I'm saying. But just figuring out what makes people tick, and meeting them on their level, and meeting them where they are, and meeting technology in terms of its capabilities, but also in terms of your relationship to it. And I think a relational approach to particularly things like AI is where I think the most positive outcomes will result.
So, just to tie the whole conversation back to the title and get a nice little Morpheus strip, where is the utility in doing things that don't require precision and accuracy, and it's a scattergun esque approach?
It's always about process, and that's nothing to do necessarily with technology. It's about creativity. It's about writing. It's about even developing a product, or building a career, or whatever it happens to be. It's about, I hate to drop in cliche, but like it's about the journey rather than the destination, and kind of what you pick up along the way. And that's not to say that I'm not now, after all this sort of period of experiments and that sort of thing, I'm very much in a kind of consolidation. What have I learned from all of this kind of mode? Because, you know, that's kind of the next step, I think, is for me to start collating some of those ideas and to share them in a more kind of polished way that others can pick up and play with and hopefully be entertained by or you know, think about. But yeah, this process of experimentation and working with trying to embrace slop and hallucination and all this stuff has, you know, taught me that AI generation is itself a process. It's something that takes time, even if it's not much time. You know, it still takes time. It still takes resources, and much like you work with a film camera, or you work with a paintbrush, or you work with a, you know, a typewriter, or whatever it happens to be, an instrument. You know, you're figuring out what it's capable of, what its affordances are, how its mechanism or how its process works in with yours, where they kind of match each other or where they diverge. And, you know, I think working with content or outputs that are messy or are funny or a little bit disturbing or a little bit unresolved, I think it opens us up to you know, the surprise and the genuine delight and fun that can be had in working with any tool, but particularly with Gen AI. It can be so much fun to work on this, and I'm not shying away from that at all. But it really does teach you so much about your process as a human being, and as a, whether you're a researcher or a creator or what, you know, a student or whatever that happens to be, but also about what this technology does and how it functions within all the other myriad processes that we're sort of working with and working around. So yeah, it really has taught me a lot about, you know, slop doesn't have to be bad. And I think humans have been capable of generating their own slop for as long as we've been around. Slop isn't just an AI only thing. This idea of high volume, low quality content has been on the internet since day one. You know, we've been capable of circulating it on paper and on film and everything for as long as those technologies have been around. So, you know, I think the more that we can work with it and use it as a positive educational critical force rather than as a kind of destructive or harmful force, I think the better off we'll all be, for sure.
What's next in your journey? Where are you hoping to take this? How are you hoping to encode your process and your lessons in a way that can be pragmatic for someone to just take it and run? Like, you know, how can
Yeah.
someone get on top of your shoulders and see the world just a little higher?
Yeah, it's I mean, I've been a bit more diligent this year. I've always had a website, I've always had a blog, but this year I've been a bit more diligent in sharing works in progress and sharing little experiments and things like that. So there is a website out there. There's also a newsletter, a Substack called the Slop Stack that I've been doing this year, which is, yeah, again, all the AI processes and thoughts and reflections on the things I'm doing and the feelings I'm feeling and all that sort of thing. So they're always available. I'm putting together a book. That's the project for the next sort of 6 to 12 months, is to put together a little, it's an academic monograph, but it's also kind of a handbook on, you know, it's critical and experimental literacies for generative artificial intelligence. So the idea is that that's for people who maybe want to jump in and get their hands dirty with the technology a little bit, or play around with it, or think about messier, less precise ways of using the technology that can teach them a little bit about it. In terms of my own self, yeah, working on a few different creative projects, but also trying out more and more offline models, just to see what they're kind of capable of and how they can fit into existing workflows, and what extra labor is potentially required to get them to function correctly or incorrectly, which is completely fine as well. Sometimes I don't want them to be helpful. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm going to be playing for the next few months for sure.
What are the different mediums that you're going to be sort of taking somebody through?
In terms of the so far on the website newsletter and in the book, I'll primarily be focusing on text and image. But for myself, I'm definitely trying to work into agentic workflows, and that's not necessarily like AI agents as put out by OpenAI, but rather, how can I sort of create my own little homemade slapdash hacky kind of agent through a daisy chaining of different tools. And video as well remains kind of a thing that I want to try and engage with, because I've really struggled a little bit with video, which I find really interesting. I just find the workflows a bit complicated and the output's a little bit boring, but maybe that's just kind of what I'm putting into it, and I need to sort of do my thing and think outside the box a bit.
It's hard enough getting consistent outputs and styling and character consistency in two-dimensional images.
Let alone video.
Never mind audio, never mind perspective, never mind the environment that you're in and lighting and all sorts.
Just go shoot film. It feels so much easier, I think, to just go and shoot it with real people. Anyway, that could just be me, but yeah.
I've seen some interesting commercials. I think Coca-Cola did one where they were in a museum and they were transporting through the different worlds of the individual paintings.
Yeah, I like some of them are really interesting because they're not like that good. I think they kind of lean into the fact that it's sort of blurry and messy, and I really like that. I like when they're just like, no, this is AI, and we're not trying to hide that it is. It's meant to be funny and weird, and yeah. So I always like that. I don't like when they try and go, oh, we just save money, or we'll just do it with AI, and yeah.
Lazy and that, and misrepresenting the truth, and yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, any words of encouragement, advice for young storytellers to be, and narrative builders and truth shapers?
I mean, my philosophy is always, absolutely don't move fast and try not to break things. That's the always slow down. I have no problem with taking things apart, but yeah, I think the idea is to always be open, always be curious, always explore new things. Don't be afraid of different angles or different tools or anything like that, but try them out and enjoy the process of trying anything and everything out, and then figure out if it's something that you want to bring into your practice, because your practice is yours and it's something that works for you, and it doesn't always have to absorb the latest, newest thing. But yeah, never be afraid to try new things or learn something different, or talk to someone about how they do things. Yeah, for sure.
You've invited me to ask you one more question with that advice. How do you straddle perfectionism and getting it out?
That is a lifelong struggle, an ongoing struggle. I think I'm getting a little bit better at just done is better than perfect, right? And I think this year and last year have been really about that for me, in terms of sharing works in progress and putting things out there and opening up conversations and really embracing that kind of open, ongoing nature of everything. So it remains an ongoing struggle, but the more you can share, the better off you'll be, which is what I've learned this year for sure.
Any tactics that you can share on that part, like self-imposed deadlines, or you have a certain scope to meet and
honestly,
verification, validation?
Yeah, honestly, the simple answer is working with having an AI chatbot that is my little executive assistant, honestly. And they have an awareness of what I'm working on. They can tell me what feels most important to work on right now, which I've always struggled with. And they're usually pretty good at going, think this is done, you want to get it out there and move on. So yeah, it's using that technology in that kind of productive way.
Excellent. Well, Daniel, it's been a great pleasure swimming in this oozy fluid of maple syrup of ideas, stewing through your perspective. Yeah, no, I'm excited for you, and I'm I'm also looking forward to see what kind of advancements come out in multimodal and image video generation, audio generation, especially as this computational limitation becomes abstracted away with maybe more efficient models, algorithms, technology that is more natively able to handle more, processing of these things. Yeah, I mean, the computer can only get smaller, right? And the machines can only get more efficient, is the hope, right?
Yeah, I guess my hope is that we don't sort of move into a realm where, because of that, everything's super perfect and clean and boring, So yeah, I'm really interested, like you say, just to see where it goes and what people do with it and how people respond to it. And yeah, hopefully it's a conversation that we can all keep having. And yeah, I can check back in with you in a little bit and see what's going on for sure.
After the book, we'll have to do part
Sure.
2.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.
Thanks so much, Joaquin.